If you know how to diagram sentences, then you know with a little bit of switching around how to diagram verbal phrases. Let's start with a sentence that does not contain a verbal phrase. And we're going to be looking at, in this video, we'll be looking at gerund phrases and infinitive phrases. That leaves one other kind of phrase, a participial phrase, for another time. So let's take a sentence. I am buying presents for you. So I is the subject. What am I doing? I am buying. What gets bought? That's our test for transitivity. And presents for you. That's what gets bought. So I'm going to put them over here. A little more space than I need. So presents. What kind of presents? Which presents? Presents for you. So that's a prepositional phrase, the way I'm construing it. And you is the object of the preposition for. So I am buying presents for you. So that's a simple sentence with a direct object. Now, supposing, in this sentence, by the way, buying is the verb. It's a present participle functioning as a verb. It's part of speech is verb. And it does not form a phrase with the word presence. Presence is the direct object of the verb, but there are only there's three phrases you could say. There's a verb phrase, am buying. There's the noun phrase, presence for you, and the prepositional phrase for you. Now, let's make this present participle that's a verb here, let's make it into a gerund and make it into the head of a gerund phrase, because gerund phrases are by definition nouns and they therefore have heads, and the head of a gerund phrase is the gerund. Now, because a gerund phrase is a noun phrase, we put it on a pedestal, and we'll see how this all fits together in a minute. And the way we show that it's a gerund is we make this little step and we're saying buying. So the gerund looks just like the present participle, but its part of speech is noun. And we say about the gerund, as with any verbal, we would test for transitivity, and we would say, well, what gets bought? It's the same question we would ask when buying is part of the verb phrase, am buying. What gets bought? And it's still presence. So the gerund takes a direct object. Presence is still the direct object of gerunds. Of buying, which is a gerund. So here is our gerund phrase, buying presents for you. And the head of that phrase, what it boils down to is buying. So, for example, if this were a subject, buying presents for you, presents is, of course, a plural. Buying is singular. And we would say buying presents is fun, not buying presents are fun. So buying is the head. And the gerund phrase that acts like a noun, which they by definition do, they can do anything that a noun can do. So for example, they could be a direct object, as they would be in the sentence, I like buying presents for you. What gets liked? Buying presents for you. That's what gets liked. And so if I put the subject there, I like buying presents for you. Now, there's three verbals, of course. Another one is the infinitive. So we can see here that it's very close to how you diagram a gerund. So infinitives can, but do not always, function as nouns. When they do function as nouns, you would put them on a pedestal, just as we have here for the gerund, and we diagram infinitive phrases as if in a way that looks like prepositional phrases, because after all they begin with the word to, which has a distinguished career as a preposition. And voila, that's a to, though it looks like a stick figure on its side. So it's still functioning as a noun. What gets liked, to buy presents for you, that sounds a little awkward, but it is functioning as a noun. It is still the direct object of like. And so you see that diagramming an infinitive phrase functioning as a noun in a sentence looks very much like diagramming a gerund phrase that functions as a noun in a sentence. Now, of course, it's not just direct objects that verbal phrases can function as. They can. So if a verbal phrase, like a gerund phrase, can do anything that a noun can do. It can be a subject, it could be a direct object, it could be an indirect object, it could be in a positive or a subjective complement or an objective complement. So if we put it back here, put our gerund buying back here, and work out another sentence that it could belong to. For example, I set aside time for buying presents for you. So here, you would have the subject is I, and what did I do? I set aside. Now here, the aside is a particle. What gets set aside? Time. That's what. So aside time is not a prepositional phrase, as you might think. It doesn't descend from set as a prepositional phrase, and time is not the object of the preposition. This is a particle, and the test we could do for that is we could equally well say, I set time aside for buying presents for you. Or we could say, I set aside time. And when you can do that, that's the classic test for testing whether something is a particle. If the sentence is, I set aside time for buying presents for you, well, the for is a preposition. The object of the preposition is now the gerund phrase, buying presents for you. Now you could construe it also to be an adjectival one, talking about the time, modifying time, but you could also construe it this way, as I have done, set aside time Y for buying presents for you. That's why. So here we have the gerund phrase now functioning as the object of a preposition. And since I substituted out the infinitive phrase for buy, to buy, namely, let's see what happens when I do that here. So once again, like that. Notice in all these transformations, presence continues to be the direct object of the verbal. Doesn't make any difference whether it's a participle or a gerund or an infinitive, we'd still do those same tests. So now we have, I set aside time for to buy presents for you. And you may think, well, that didn't work out because you don't say that. And it's true, you probably wouldn't say it now, but that used to be a standard way of speaking. For example, in the King James Bible, if you looked at Genesis chapter 41, verse 57, you would get, and all countries came into Egypt for to buy corn, for to buy grain. And if that may actually sort of trigger some memories of reading old texts where this used to be an idiomatic way of doing things, but infinitives no longer are typically used as objects of the preposition for, but gerund phrases certainly still are.